Now Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, a very astute critic of Nietzsche. He was educated by Freud. And Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. You know, it was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind. And we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And you know, now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk because that's everything that's been discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living sub-personalities, each with its own set of motivations and perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well, which is one of Jung's objections to Nietzsche's idea that we could create our own values. So Jung didn't believe that, especially not after interacting with Freud, because he saw that human beings were affected by things that were deeply, deeply affected by things that were beyond their conscious control. And no one really knows how to conceptualize those things. You know, the cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. You know, it has a viewpoint and it says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit you, it inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity that inhabits the body politic like a thought inhabits the brain. That's one way of thinking about it. It's a very strange way of thinking, but it certainly has its merits. And those things, well, in some sense, those are deities, although it's not that simple. And so Jung got very interested in dreams and started to understand the relationship between dreams and myths, because he would see in his clients' dreams echoes of stories that he knew because he was deeply read in mythology. And then he started to believe that the dream was the birthplace of the myth, and that there was a continual interaction between the two processes, the dream and the story, and storytelling. And well, you know, you tend to tell your dreams as stories when you remember them. And some people remember dreams all the time, like 2 or 3 a night. I've had clients like that, and they often have archetypal dreams that have very clear mythological structures. I think that's more the case with people who are creative, by the way, especially if they're a bit unstable at the time, because the dream tends to occupy the space of uncertainty and to concentrate on fleshing out the unknown reality before you get a real grip on it. So it's like the dream is the birthplace of thinking. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so because it's the birthplace of thinking, it's not that clear. It's doing its best to formulate something. That was Jung's notion, as opposed to Freud, who believed that there were sensors, internal sensors, that were hiding the dream's true message. That's not what Jung believed. He believed the dream was doing its best to express a reality that was still outside of fully articulated conscious comprehension. It was, because you think, look, a thought appears in your head, right? That's obvious. Bang, it's nothing you ever ask about. But what the hell does that mean? A thought appears in your head. What kind of ridiculous explanation is that? You know, it just doesn't help with anything. Where does it come from? Well, nowhere. It just appears in my head. Okay, well, that's not a very sophisticated explanation, as it turns out, you know? And so you might think that those thoughts that you think, well, where do they come from? Well, they're often someone else's thoughts, right? Someone long dead, that might be part of it, just like the words you use to think are utterances of people who've been long dead. And so you're informed by the spirit of your ancestors. That's one way of looking at it. And your motivations speak to you, and your emotions speak to you, and your body speaks to you. And it all does all that, at least in part, through the dream. And the dream is the birthplace of the fully articulated idea. They don't just come from nowhere fully fledged, right? They have a developmental origin, and God only knows how lengthy that origin is. Even to say something like, I am conscious, that's taken... Chimpanzees don't say that. It's been 7 million years since we broke from chimpanzees, something like that from the common ancestor. They have no articulated knowledge at all. They have very little self-representation in some sense, and very little self-consciousness. And that's not the case with us at all. And we had to painstakingly figure all of this out during that, 7 million year voyage. And I think some of that's represented and captured in some sense in these ancient stories, which I believe were part of, especially the oldest stories in Genesis, which is the stories we're going to start with, that some of the archaic nature of the human being is encapsulated in those stories, and it's very, very instructive as far as I can tell. I can give you just a quick example. There's an idea of sacrifice in the Old Testament, and it's pretty barbaric. I mean, the story of Abraham and Isaac is a good example of that, because Abraham is called on to actually sacrifice his own son, which doesn't really seem like something that a reasonable God would ask you to do, right? And the God in the Old Testament is frequently cruel and arbitrary and demanding and paradoxical, and which is one of the things that really gives the book life, because it wasn't edited by a committee, a committee that was concerned with not offending anyone, that's for sure. So Jung believed that the dream was the birthplace of thought. And I've been extending that idea because one of the things I wondered about deeply was, you have a dream and then someone interprets it. And you can argue about whether or not an interpretation is valid, just like you can argue about whether your interpretation of a novel or movie is valid, right? It's a very difficult thing to determine with any degree of accuracy, which counts in part for the postmodern critique. But my observation has been that people will present a dream, and sometimes we can extract out real useful information from it that the person didn't appear to know. And they get a flash of insight, and to me that's a marker that we've stumbled on something that unites part of that person that wasn't united before. It pulls things together, which is often what a good story will do, or sometimes a good theory. Things snap together for you, and there's a little light goes on, and that's one of the markers that I've used for accuracy in dreams. And I know in my own family, when I was first married, I'd have fights with my wife, arguments about this and that, and I'm fairly hot-headed, and so I'd get all puffed up and, agitated about whatever we were arguing about, and she'd go to sleep, which was really annoying, so annoying, because I couldn't sleep, right? I was like chewing off my fingernails, and she'd be like sleeping peacefully beside me. It's like maddening. But often she'd have a dream, and then the next morning she'd discuss it with me, and then we could unravel what was at the bottom of our argument. And that was unbelievably useful, even though it was extraordinarily aggravating. So I was convinced by Jung. It looked to me like his ideas about the relationship between dreams and mythology and drama and literature made sense to me, and the relationship between that and art. I know this native carver, he's a Kwakwaka'wakw guy. He's carved a bunch of wooden sculptures, totem poles, and masks that I have in my house. And he's a very interesting person, not literate, not particularly literate, and really still steeped in this ancient 13,000-year-old tradition. He's an original language speaker. And the fact that he isn't literate has sort of left him with the mind of someone who's pre-literate. And pre-literate people aren't stupid, they're just not literate, so their brains are organized differently in many ways. And I've asked him about his intuition for his carvings, and he's told me that he dreams, like you've seen the Haida masks, you know what they look like. Well, his people are closely related to the Haida, so it's the same kind of style. He said he dreams in those animals and can remember his dreams, and he also talks to his grandparents who taught him how to carve in his dreams. Quite often, if he runs into a problem with carving, his grandparents will come and he'll talk to them, but he sees the creatures that he's going to carve living in an animated sense in in his imagination. And I mean, it's not that difficult. First of all, I have no reason to disbelieve him. He's a very, very straightforward person, and he doesn't have the motivation or the guile, I would say, in some sense, to invent a story like that. There's just no reason he would possibly do it. I don't think he's told that many people about it. He thinks it's kind of crazy, you know. He said when he was a kid, he thought he was insane because he'd had those dreams all the time about these creatures and so forth. And so it wasn't something he was trumpeting. But I found it fascinating because I can see in him part of the manifestation of this unbroken tradition. We have no idea how traditions like that are really passed along for thousands and thousands of years, right? Part of it's oral and memory, part of it's acted out and dramatized, and then part of it's going to be imaginative. And people who aren't literate, they store information quite differently than we do. We don't remember anything. It's all written down in books, right? But if you're from an oral culture, especially if you're trained in that way, you have all of that information at hand, both so you can speak it, you can tell the stories, and you really know them. And you know, modern people don't really know what that's like anymore. I doubt if there's more than maybe 2 of you in the audience that could spout from memory like a 30-line poem. You know, and poetry was written so that people could do that. That's why we have that form, is so that people could remember it and have it with them. And we don't do any of that anymore. Anyways, back to Jung. Jung was a great believer in the dream, and I noted that dreams will tell you things that you don't know. And then I thought, well, how the hell can that be? How in the world can something you think up tell you something you don't know? How does that make any sense? First of all, why don't you understand it? Why does it have to come forth in the form of the dream? It's like there's something going on inside you that you don't control, right? The dream happens to you just like life happens to you.